though they've been used for other purposes, including identifying plants that pose a risk of environmental harm, or even plants to include on do not plant lists. And this creates a need to ensure that lists are developed in consistent and credible manner. So what I'm going to do today is just talk a little bit about the history of plant listing and how this project came about, a little bit about the ASTM process, and then a little bit about what is in the standard. Let's start out with a little bit of history of invasive plant lists using the Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council as an example because that's what I'm familiar with. So over the past 15 years, each of the state chapters of the Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council has developed or adopted an invasive plant list, but they're all different. Periodically, there's been discussion about whether the list should be more consistent or if there should be minimum standards, but that never went too far. Until in 2011, with funding from the Forest Service, the Southeast EPSI was able to spend some time comparing methodologies used by the Southeast EPSI chapters to create invasive plant lists. Also sent out a survey to gauge the knowledge and perceptions of use and creation of the lists, with the ultimate goal to make recommendations on how the chapters might work together to improve lists. So this table highlights some of the findings, and I don't want to focus on particular states, but I do want you to note that aside from providing a plant name and the invasive ranking, there was little consistency between lists. And there was also significant differences in the stated definitions of the invasive categories, differences in determining thresholds for invasiveness, differences in how clearly the criteria was explained, and how transparent the whole process was. The overall recommendations from the effort was that key elements of a list should include a stated purpose for the list, a clearly identified structure, transparency in the structure and methodology, and the ability to access key data online and updates every 2 to 4 years. And consistency was not included as a key element. However, the survey that was sent out did ask a few questions about consistency, and in response to the question of would increased consistency across lists be an improvement, 57 responded yes, that lists would be more defensible and it would lead to raised awareness about invasive plants. 37% said maybe due to pros and cons, and 6% said no because situations across states vary and because of the additional work required. So in the meantime, at the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council meeting in August of 2011, Susan Gitlin with the EPA approached Chuck Bergeron about developing a standardized approach for invasive plant listing, primarily for green building codes. Here's a picture of Chuck Bergeron, carbohydrate loading to make it through a particularly long Southeast EPSI meeting. But he noted that in addition to being useful for green building codes, that invasive plant lists usually lack regulatory power, but a national standard could increase their impact. So then at NISAW 3 years ago, Chuck and other NAIPC board members met with Susan and got the ball rolling to proceed with this project. The ball was rolling a bit slowly, though, because it wasn't until January of 2013 that things actually got moving. And that was with this invitation that Doug Johnson sent out to the NAIPC board. And this was a few of us are starting to work on developing an ASTM standard for listing invasive plants. Having a standard will make the list stronger so that landscaping guidelines and building codes can point to them. We have help from someone who is very involved in developing ASTM standards and green building codes. We could use a couple more people. Do you have anyone in your EPSI who would be good for working on this? They don't need to be a plant expert as much as experienced in the process of listing plants. So having been involved with plant listing in Alabama for 10 years and involved with the Southeast EPSI grant project, I answered the call along with others from around the country. Susan Gitlin with the EPA is the person that Doug mentioned in his email, and she's worked closely with ASTM and has led us through this project. Doug is the de facto co-chair of the working group. And I will mention that Doug and I drew straws to see who would give this webinar, and I drew the give the webinar straw. But as Chuck mentioned, Doug is on the call and will help field any questions at the end. So if you're not familiar with ASTM, that stands for American Standards for Testing and Measurements. It's actually now an international organization, and they develop standards to enhance the performance and to help everyone have confidence in the things they buy and use. And you can find more about that at astm.org. So let's switch gears now and talk a little bit about what is in the how the ASTM process works. So the first step is to develop the standard, and that is using as many stakeholders as possible. And once the standard is developed, you have to go through several levels of balloting. The first level is the task force, which is the level just above the working group. Then the subcommittee, which is comprised of about 300 people, and then the full committee of about 700 people. It typically takes 7 to 2 years to develop and finalize a standard, and we're at about 2 years right now. So our goal was to develop a standard minimum criteria and procedures for developing an invasive plant list for a given region. And one of the end users of lists created with the standard would be the building codes and standards, because whenever they restrict use of invasive plants, they must reference a valid list of invasive plants for the region, which begs the question of what a valid list is. Other end users would be invasive plant councils, agencies, and others that create lists. So here's the process that we went through to create the list. The first step was information gathering. Began that in March of 2013. Looked at the best aspects of existing lists and weed risk assessments, the scientific literature, and developed a survey tool for comparing existing lists and weed risk assessments. And that was sent out to the NAIPSI board to share with state IPSIs and EPSIs. And our goal was to align the standard with existing lists so that bringing these lists into compliance would not be onerous. Second step was to begin writing the standard, which we started in April of 2013. We had a draft ready to send out to the state EPSIs for review and comment by September. Another draft was then sent to the ASTM task group for comment by the end of the year. It was ready for preliminary balloting at the task force level in February of 2014. Made revisions addressing comments from that effort, and then was ready for full balloting in June of 2014. So here's a little bit about how balloting works in ASTM. So all members of the subcommittee, and that's like I mentioned before, about 300 people, must cast a ballot. And they can either vote in the affirmative, they may abstain, or they may vote in the negative. For affirmative or abstention votes, they may provide comments, either pro or con, or of any sort, but they don't have to provide a comment. Negative comment or negative vote, they must provide a comment to explain why they voted in the negative. So the results from our balloting were that 221 people abstained, 103 voted yes, and 7 voted no. So you might be wondering why so many people abstained, and part of that is because many members of the subcommittee may be focused on the development of other standards. And if they're not familiar or involved with this particular standard, they may choose to abstain. So of those that did vote, 94% voted in favor. And in most cases, that'd be a landslide, and you'd think we'd be good to go. But that's not the way it works, because ASTM works through consensus building, and all negative votes must be addressed. And there's 3 different approaches to this. First could be that the working group figures, oh, good point, we'll fix that. The other is that after dialogue, the vote may withdraw the negative comment. Another outcome Could be that the working group decides that the negative comment is not persuasive and they don't feel that they can make any changes to address it. So the catch here, though, is that all negative comments have to be presented to the entire committee for a vote to see if they agree that the comment is non-persuasive. And we did have several unresolved negative comments, some philosophical differences against plant listing of any kind, the standard not scientific enough, too much of a tree hugger and liberal California vibe, or worried about potential impacts on the green industry. So at this point, we had to weigh our options. It's a bit like playing chess at this point. We could put the negative comments up for a ballot, but there was really no way to know what all of the people who abstained would do. Would they still abstain, or would they jump into the fray at this point? Or we could adjust the language in the standard, then submit a new version for balloting. But it could end up that all the people that had cast a negative vote would do so again, and we wouldn't be much further along than we were to start with. But by this point, we'd missed the window to have the standard referenced in the green building codes, so we decided to go with the second option and adjust some of the language that had been somewhat problematic and seemed to contribute to some of the negative comments. So back to the drawing board we went and started to revise the standard. And one of the major points of contention was the definition of invasive. We had referenced the Executive Order 13112 that most of you are probably familiar with, but several of the negative comments we received referenced the NISC and ISAC white paper, parts of which are a bit ambiguous. So although the definition refers to a species that causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health, the white paper at time implies a requirement for net harm. And since our standard didn't address economic harm or benefit of benefit of a species, this created a problem. So we went round and round on this, but finally settled on going with the term environmentally harmful rather than invasive. And the title of the standard is now a standard practice for creating a list of plants that are environmentally harmful in a defined geographic region. So now what I want to do is talk about what is actually in the standard. It begins with a rationale statement, scope, terminology, summary of the practice, gets into the significance and potential use, and then into the procedure for creating the list and the report. And these last two are what I want to focus on today. So as far as the procedure, start out by defining the region for which the list is being developed, and then identify and notify entities within the region with potential interest in the development or content of the list. And then identify which plants are going to be assessed. It could be the whole region of Florida, non-native species of the region, or the like. And then plan assessment, which involves assessment of current environmental harm and assessment of potential future environmental harm. I'll talk more about that. And then finally the report, which I'll also talk more about. And one note, existing lists for the region that have been developed using methodology that meets the standard can be accepted for inclusion in the list without going through the assessment. Okay, so more about the assessment of the current environmental harm. First thing to look at is the extent the plant has formed self-sustaining populations outside of cultivation. This includes the number and size of established populations and the number of ecological communities impacted. And then look at the abiotic and biotic effects, including alteration of ecosystem processes, alteration of plant community composition and structure, and impact to wildlife. I'll go over these in a little more detail. As far as alteration of ecosystem processes, this includes fire occurrence, frequency, and intensity, geomorphological processes, hydrological regimes, and nutrient and mineral dynamics. Just point out now, too, that if any of these factors, if it's deemed inapplicable to the species or the region, it can be omitted. And then alteration of plant community. It's a long list here, don't want to go through it all, but essentially formation of stands dominated by the species, reduction of or extirpation of populations of native species, especially keystone or rare species, changes in rich diversity, reductions in propagules dispersal, creation or changes in structural layers, changes, distribution patterns or fragmentation of native communities, potential for hybridization, or even creation of vectors or intermediate hosts of pests or pathogens of native species. Impact to wildlife includes extirpation or endangerment of existing native species or population, reduction of habitat, food availability or quality, migratory corridors, interference with native pollinators, injurious components that damage the mouth and gut of wildlife, or even poisonous plants. So that is the current environmental harm, and then the next step is assessment of future environmental harm. And that starts out, and so this can include plants that are already present in the area or plants that are on the horizon. So it starts out with known current harm, if it is a plant that's already there. So this is from the previous section. Also considers the behavior and impact of the plant or the species outside of the defined region, the reproductive potential, dependence on disturbance for establishment, and vectors for dispersal. As far as behavior and impact outside of the defined region, looking at environmental harm caused elsewhere, especially in regions with similar climate, environmental harm caused by closely related species, or observed rate of spread within the region or elsewhere. Reproductive potential includes age of first reproduction, amount and frequency of seed set, longevity of seeds in the seed bank, capacity for vegetative reproduction and resprouting, and potential for outcrossing. And then dependence on disturbance. A lot of disturbances here, man-made, natural disturbances, changes in fire regimes and hydrology, or even nutrient-loaded, grazing by domestic or feral livestock, and wildlife activities. Vectors for dispersal includes whether or not the species is still available for sale commercially, either agriculture, horticulture, or aquarium trade, whether the species is still used for forage, erosion control, or revegetation. It's a common contaminant in seed or hay and the like, whether it's commonly spread along transportation and utility corridors, transported on boats or trailers, consumed and dispersed by birds and other animals, whether it has sticky or bird propagules that makes it particularly easy to be spread by pets and people, whether it has buoyant propagules, making it easy to be spread by water, wind-dispersed propagules, and detachable vegetative propagules. So that sums up what is in the assessment. The next step then is for each of the species that has been assessed, it has to be reviewed and classified by a review team. A little bit about the classification system. The practice does not set an exact threshold for what qualifies a plant to be classified as invasive. This was to allow for flexibility with differences between regions and possible differences in stakeholder needs. So the thresholds and additional ranking system, if used, are determined by the review team based on best professional judgment. Minimum standards are invasive, non-invasive, or further assessment needed. The process should be transparent and clearly described in the final report. The review team consists of a minimum of 5 individuals, and the majority of the members of the team shall have expertise in the study or management of invasive plants and represent one or more of the following types of organizations: governmental natural resource, environmental protection, or land management agencies, or environmental science, biology, or natural resource management departments of academic institutions. So then a draft statement of the assessment findings is produced. It should include the plant name, scientific and common, the date completed, and the findings made for each of the factors in the assessment. If any of the factors was omitted, you need to include a reason for doing so. Also include all references used. And then ending with the classification category assigned by the review team. And this document goes out for public review. It should be available for a minimum of 60 days. And after it comes back, the team needs to address the comments that have been received. And then a final report is constructed, essentially the invasive plant list, but also a record of procedures that were used to develop the list. So the process for selecting the plants for assessment, the list of plants assessed, and for each species assessed, you have to have a description of the methodologies used to assess it, citations of information sources, public comments received and response to comments, the category to which it was classified, and the date of classification, and the names and affiliations of the review team. And one note, you may have one review team for the entire process, or you could have different teams for different species. Also included in the final report should be a description of the classification system. And finally, a name and contact information for the person who will serve as the point of contact. So the current status is that a revised draft was balloted in late fall of last year. We made a few changes in January, and we're currently undergoing another round of balloting, and there will be a full committee meeting and ballot in April, and that will be held in California. And with that, I know I've sped right through this, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Nancy. And the questions, if you'll type your questions into the question box, then we can answer as many as we have time and have interest for. We already do have one question, and it is, would the term environmentally harmful open the door for listing aggressive native species? Or did that come up in the conversation?
So I have to look specifically. I think we do have non-native in front of environmentally harmful. Yes.
Yeah.
We are dealing with, yeah.
Yeah, we do have the federal definition of invasive species in there, so it does have to be non-native introduced by humans.
Okay, next question. For species that have been assessed using the USDA APHIS PERALWRA, would those automatically be included for a region? And we might need more information about those acronyms. I guess weed risk assessment is the WRA.
Yeah, this is Doug. Basically, I think the question is if APHIS has done a thorough assessment on it, does that count? And I think one of the things that is in the standard is a clause that allows a review team to adopt an existing review if it meets all the qualifications of the standard. So, for instance, APHIS is probably the gold standard of evaluation. And so if they've done a thorough evaluation of a plant, then that could be adopted. The only qualification would be to make sure that it's appropriate for the geographic region of concern.
So if a group, the next question would be, if a group weighs environmental damage with economic benefit when deciding upon their list, would it still qualify as meeting the standards?
Well, the standard is set up to be a minimum. So yes, you can add on to it as long as it's also met the minimum. And that, and it's specified.
I think we struggled with that, and I think in many cases, if a list is going to be used for any sort of regulatory or quasi-regulatory purpose, then other factors besides environmental harm may need to be considered. And so if an organization has an evaluation protocol that includes not only environmental harm but also economic impact, as long as the environmental harm aspect of it fulfills all of the qualifications of the standard, I think that would be appropriate. It would be most clear if the environmental harm were determined as its own parameter, and then economic harm or benefit were determined as its own parameter, and then the two were combined. Otherwise, I think it would be challenging to know how the two were mixed together, because this standard is specifically for evaluating environmental harm. And so in terms of the determination, invasive, non-invasive, or needs more study, that assessment is basically saying, does it have significant environmental harm or significant risk of future environmental harm?
Okay, and we've got a handful of questions that have come in now, so I'm just going to go through these in the order they came in. The last question, I think it'll be a short one. Do you know of any grants that may become available for local governments?
Not aware of any.
Yeah, I mean, this is setting the standard up, and the organization, both National Invasive Plant Council and ASTM, are not really set up to provide funding to develop these lists once the listing standard is available.
That is correct.
That said, CalIPT has applied for some funding that would, among other things, push this process forward. So if we're fortunate and the standard is approved in April, then the next step, I think, is for existing entities who have lists to work on their lists to make sure that they comply with the standard, and for new organizations who have a need to make lists to get a little assistance in applying the standard. So I'm not quite sure what form that will take, but we have a pretty broad community of organizations out there who have experience in creating these lists. And so, helping each other form strong, consistent, credible lists will be a logical next step, and I think that will be potentially an attractive task for funders to support, whether agencies or private foundations, especially if the list has a reason for being, if it's a list for landscaping guidelines or management prioritization, that kind of thing. That may be a compelling argument to funders to support list making. But in terms of specific grants available at this point, nothing to point at.
The next question, have you done an assessment on how many existing state plant lists comply with these minimum standards?
That's a great question. Nancy, do you want to address that, or do you want me to start?
Let's see, I think it was MIPIN that did a small study looking at how many of organizations in that area might comply. And definitely it didn't seem like anyone could just have a direct shoe-in, but there were several that it wouldn't be a huge onerous task. Beyond that, I'm not sure of any comparisons.
That's accurate. I think the Midwest Invasive Plant Network did a pretty thorough job of talking to various states in their region about how well their current lists match the standard. And in general, I think the contents of the list, in terms of the parameters that are studied, are pretty much there. But the things around the edges, like how much notice is given to stakeholders, how's the process documented and posted online, I think some of those things that are there for transparency and credibility, those things may take a little bit of work. But the goal for the standard was to capitalize on the quality work that has been done to date, and to make sure that, without having to do anything too much and too much beyond what already exists, which is very valuable, that EPCs and others who have lists could comply with the standard. So the answer is probably 0 at this point, but the answer should be that a large portion of those already with lists can comply with a fairly small amount of effort.
Sorry, I was on mute. The last question was explain. Oh gosh, explain what is meant by non-native. Is it just to a individual ecosystem, or is it larger than that? And if I'm misremembering your question, please submit it again. But I think that was the gist of it.
I guess my answer to that would be that we've adopted the federal definition, and the federal definition, and Nancy corrects me if this is off, but basically not native to that ecosystem and introduced through human agency.
Right. Actually, in our terminology, alien species, with respect to a particular ecosystem, any species, including its seeds, eggs, spores, or other biological material, capable of propagating that species that is not native to that ecosystem.
But in general, I think the way the term is applied by invasive plant councils is something that is obviously not from there. It's not something that just moved over from the state next to you. It's something that has come from another continent, was brought here either on purpose or by accident by humans, and is spreading. And I think one of the questions that gets asked frequently is, well, what about species whose range is expanding due to climate change? And I think the answer to that is, if it's a native species and it's spreading into places that haven't historically been because the climate is changing, most of us would probably consider that still native, even though climate change would be seen as anthropogenic. But if it's an invasive species already and it spreads from one region to another region, it's of course still invasive.
Well, and this can also be addressed in the selection of the plant species to be assessed section. So you could make that definition more narrow or broad depending on your objectives, as long as it's clearly stated what you're doing.
So along those same lines, in the classification of environmentally harmful plants, are considerations given for varieties or subspecies of species, such as Phragmites australis, subspecies australis, where the subspecies is non-native, but there's also a native subspecies? or and I'm going to butcher this name, so I'm not going to read it, but where there's a more problematic variety that spreads of a certain species. So has that been discussed, I guess, as part of this?
Yes, so that is addressed. We have a section stating that subspecies, varieties, and cultivars or interspecific hybrids of plant species are acceptable as subjects for assessment when information exists to suggest that the subspecies, etc., are more or less harmful to the environment than the species. So you can choose to assess them individually as specific taxa. But once again, that has to be stated in the section where you're selecting your plant species to be assessed.
So there's a few questions here, and I'm going to try to group them the best I can. How has the green industry responded to the process, given one of the major use would be restricting planting of listed species? And then, has there been consistent theme in the concerns by the green industry? If so, have those concerns been addressed? And I think the other one was, what extent the hort industry has been involved in this subcommittee and in support of the initiative.
Do you want to field that one, Doug?
Sure, I'll start, and you can add. I think the green industry has been involved to a certain extent because many of the EPCs that have had representatives involved in developing the standard do include representatives from the green industry in their groups. And so there's been an out through the EPCs to those partners. However, the primary development has been people who are agency or university experts in invasive plant species. But we have had review and feedback from American Hort, for instance. And I think the primary concern is that whatever assessments, however this assessment is used, that it be appropriate. And I think the initial concern when somebody looks at this, and I think it has to do with the fact that we use the word invasive in various ways, but when you look at this, we're using the term invasive to mean environmentally harmful. And if somebody were then to take that term invasive and say, okay, well, this plant's invasive, therefore, we shouldn't be sold, that may be overstepping because we're looking at one factor. We're not looking at human health. We're not looking at economy. So I think through the conversations we've had, I'm hopeful that we have addressed concerns from folks that this will be used in whatever way is most appropriate. These lists already exist out there. IPCs are making these lists, and this standard is there to strengthen them. And it's not meant for cultivated areas. It's not meant for landscaped areas. It's meant for impacts in natural areas. So that was another potential concern. So I think at this point we've taken the steps necessary to clarify any confusion. And I guess just finally, I would say one of the ways we're looking at potentially using our list here in California is as an optional tier for green building beyond what the state legally lists as noxious weeds, so that if one wanted to get extra credit for green building, that you wouldn't plant any of the plants on CalIPSY's list above and beyond what the state lists as noxious weeds. So that's a voluntary measure that allows, it helps put the information out there for landscapers who want to be conservative about making sure they're not using anything that could be a problem, but it's not regulating anything. So I think that's the line we're walking, is really trying to make sure that information is available for land managers or for conservative landscapers to access information on what is a problem and what could be a problem in the future.
Okay, so, and I think there's maybe a little bit of some of there's still some confusion maybe. So one question is, what regions seem to be ready to start on the ASTM regional list once the standard has been approved? And then another question that's very similar, although the ASTM standard seems to be intended for state list compliance, should local government and non-governmental organizations list aim to comply? So I don't know if you can address both of those kind of at the same time or not.
So I'm not sure if any one region is more poised to start developing ASTM standard list or not. The standard is definitely appropriate for use by the state EPCs, but also geared towards smaller entities, governments, state governments or cities, other municipalities. However, that was one concern of the green industry, that there would be too many lists that could overlap in the geographic region that they cover, which could lead to some confusion if they weren't the same.
So yeah, I would echo what you said, Nancy, that the standard is designed and intended to be used at multiple scales, and it really is. It talks about impacts in the geographic region of concern. So that could be a municipality, it could be a state, it could be a region, etc. And I think I'm not sure if the way you phrased your first question, Chuck, was the way the question was originally phrased from the source, but there won't be any ASTM lists. The ASTM product is the standard, which is really just the template, the guidelines. You need to meet these criteria to say that your list complies. So I would say, in terms of who's ready to go, it would be all the folks who currently have lists. So there's some 30-odd states are covered by invasive plant councils at this point, and I would guess most, if not all, of those have fairly authoritative invasive plant lists for the states they cover.
Yeah, that was how it was originally worded, and that's why I thought there maybe was some confusion. And so moving on from that, and there's a couple of questions here, and I think I can group these together again. Is there a group that will certify a list as meeting these standards, or is it self-evaluation? And then what is the process of having it approved with the standard? Will the standard approve the list or the criteria for listing? Is there a central database of what entities meet the standard? Yeah, so those two, I guess, kind of
sounds like the persons asking those questions should be on the working group. That would be, those all sound like great ideas. So in answer to the first question, which I think is very important, no, ASTM doesn't do any enforcement of standards. So I think the simplest first setup will be that it'll be on good faith that an FC goes through the steps to making sure that they're in compliance with the standards. So we may come up with a checklist or something to facilitate that process, and I think those FCs working on that will be supporting each other and working together to figure out the most effective way to go through the process. And so I think, just given the community of experts and people interested in this topic, there will be a certain pressure for nobody to skirt the process and say, yeah, we comply, when they don't, because I think that would make you look pretty bad and you'd lose credibility. National IPSI doesn't have any funding for this, but it would potentially be an appropriate role for that organization as kind of a community of peers to conduct oversight and help groups go through the process and give some sort of a confirmation at the end that, yes, it looks like you've done everything you need to do. And then putting the information online and consolidated, that's a great idea. That's right in line with what the current National IPSI website is trying to do, to link, in one place, link to all the state IPSIs so that you can you can find information quickly. And I think if as multiple states begin to put up lists and compliance, then I think systems like EdMaps that map nationally could be a great resource for showing different lists and different regions. I mean, I am tending to think state-wise, but there could be other geographic regions that make sense as well. And I think that ties very closely into national mapping efforts and looking at where each species is and making sure that each state is kind of on the same page in terms of what's a problem and what should be worked on where.
So, a few more questions. Would there be any value in including a numeric score or other ranking system to support the threshold for classifying a plant as invasive or non-invasive? What would be the drawbacks of including such a ranking system?
You want to go, Nancy, or want me to take a try?
The reason we didn't do that was to allow for flexibility. And obviously, when developing the classification system, a numerical system would be a good way to go. But we didn't include it in this because of the issues of flexibility and different uses of lists and what have you.
Flexibility goes to the earlier question about how much effort is it going to take? Is anybody complying yet, and how much effort will it take for people to comply? I think each state has, some states I'm sure have built off of other states, but you have the list of factors that need to be considered. Different states have picked up those lists of factors, and one state may score it 1, 2, 3, and someone else may score it A, B, C. And so there are multiple structures out there. They're all looking at the same content, but they're done in different ways. I personally think it would be great if we had consistency and everyone was using a kind of a universal system, but I think that's going to take more work and maybe a next step. And along with that, I agree with Nancy. I think a numerical system is perhaps it aids transparency. I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily give any more accuracy, but in terms of looking at how things were scored and understanding what decisions were made by a review team, I think that could help. And then really comparing plant A to plant B, how it comes out in terms of overall environmental harm, I think the numerical score could be useful as well. But I think in the near term, the decision was, hey, let's let the systems use whatever they're currently using as long as it stands up to scrutiny and is considering all of the content, and that's acceptable, whether it's numeric or something else. And then and that's maybe a discussion for the future is, do we want to develop a best management practice for assessment in terms of a particular protocol system that people might migrate to, and it might aid the cross-border online database that was mentioned earlier as well, so that you can look at something that scores 68 in one state, scores 64 in another state, and it's all in the same system. That one may have some significant advantages.
A few other questions, and then I think that there's a comment I got via email that I think might be worth addressing with the folks that are still on the phone. One question was, do you see the standards being applied to what species are included in invasive plant guidebooks, which can become de facto lists? I think I've sort of talked about that, but
well, I would say that usually when lists, the guidebooks that I'm familiar with will typically like in the beginning, they'll say, where is it from and what kind of plant is it, et cetera, and who lists it as what. So that they do tie together, but there should be a kind of a reference to, we're calling this an invasive plant because Texas IPSC says it's a moderate alert species. here's the online URL to check, because who knows, maybe that's changed since this book was published. So hopefully it is acknowledged that the state of knowledge is continually increasing, and assessments change, and species can be reassessed, and that may shift. Usually they get reassessed as worse, but not always. And so I think, yes, having books that are static and say this is invasive are probably not as useful as online databases that are kept current. And I think, as Nancy mentioned, as part of the metadata for the listing, there is a date along with who said so and all of the details of the assessment as well. So as Calipsy recently did, we were petitioned to reevaluate blue gum eucalyptus, and so people can say, hey, I'm not sure this is as current as it should be. I'm not sure it includes all of the more recent information. Let's reevaluate it.
And Chris Evans sent a question and volunteered to develop a seal that people could use on their lists. I think he was asking if National IPSI could provide that seal, but I'm going to take that as he's going to design that seal. And
well, and design. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead and answer that, and then.
I was just going to say, yeah, having a design for a seal would be great, but I think that the key is really to have a robust process that everyone looks at and says, oh, that's great. That seal means something to us, and so that's going to take experts' time and stakeholder representatives' time to say, yes, we looked through this whole process and everything seems to be in place. So whether we can do that with an all-volunteer army, I'm not sure. That may require some grant funds, but I think that's a great idea.
And I'm going to throw this question in, then I want to, because it kind of follows along, and then I'll ask the last two questions. Is there any potential plans to develop a corresponding key? I've seen University of Florida use a similar approach for firewise plants. This is this is a numeric kind of system. Has that been brought up in any of the discussion?
No, we haven't talked about that.
Okay.
Interesting idea.
And these standards, to quickly answer a question, these standards are not publicly available until they are completely through the ASTM process, right?
That is correct.
Because somebody asked if they were available, and I got an email.
Yeah, it's a little counterintuitive, and we did send them out earlier in the process. But once they're in balloting through ASTM's rules are that it stays internal until it's done, and there are various reasons for that. But I think Nancy's description was thorough and gave a great sense for what's actually in the text of the thing.
And I got an email, and unfortunately, the I don't think the person that emailed me is still on the call, but I maybe I see where the question's coming from, and so maybe if y'all could address this, and then if anybody else has any questions while you are addressing this, we can put them in. So the email was that they didn't get much out of this webinar, that the process seems totally bureaucratic with no results. Dismaying. Did I miss something? And maybe, I don't know if others feel the same. Others on this call have got that impression of this, but I guess I'll say, going back to what I said when this idea was originally brought to me, this right now, state invasive plant councils develop lists and they have no backbone. And then a lot of times you have lists and then you have noxious weed laws, but there's no in between. And I think this is the potential to get something that is a good in between that can be kind of a voluntary regulation. And so maybe that's something that y'all want to address, because the process is so complicated and it's taking so long, but I think the end result is going to be something that could be very powerful.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, making a list is certainly, you could describe that as a bureaucratic process, but certainly having some bureaucratic standing is, well, certainly having the scientific analysis is useful to land managers. Having the useful for agencies to understand and develop policy of where they want to go, and then having both a science-driven but also open, transparent process is really important for other stakeholders who this might affect, like the green industry. So if I were a nursery person, I would be concerned that some group of people I didn't know was going to say that some of the things I'm selling aren't okay to sell. That's a really understandable concern. So I think the ability to put together a science-based list where it's really transparent, where all the information is coming from and why certain assessments are being made is really important. And we don't have necessarily in all of our states a process that really does that thoroughly. That's in large part why invasive plant councils have sprung up, is to fill in the gap where traditional weed agencies might be focusing mostly on weeds of croplands or weeds of timberlands or weeds of rangelands, and may not have quite caught up to invasive plants of environmental harm. And so IPCs have really led the way in terms of assessing that, and this standard gives a more formal way for recognizing those lists.
And we had one more or two more questions come in, and if anybody else has got one, let's get those in, and then we can, since we're right at an hour. Federal and state funding follows federal and state guidelines and lists. Other funding sources could support the standard, like foundations. I guess that was as much of a statement. And then is there a press release on the effort? And I guess there would be once the standard is passed, correct? I mean, one could be created once the standard's passed. But
there was a press release early on by ASTM that this working group was off and running and what they're working on. I think we could dig up that URL. That's still online, I imagine. But yes, definitely federal and state agencies. I mean, certainly here in California, they all use the CalIPC list, and they're all active members of helping make the list and structure their land management around the lists and the maps and all of that. And I would imagine it's vastly similar with other states. And yes, I think they have a really strong interest in making sure that there are solid science-based lists. And I think foundation funders would as well, especially with the connection to responsible landscaping and finding ways to decrease the potential that horticultural plants will escape. And frankly, the industry themselves as well. They've been very supportive in terms of American Hort, through the Horticultural Research Institute, has funded research at the University of California, Davis to come up with a more streamlined assessment tool for potential horticultural plants to see if they could become invasive in the future, and that's a real help to the industry so that they can look at that up front before they put a bunch of money into developing a new product. They can decide that that's going to be pretty risky. So I think there's a lot of interest and willingness in the horticultural trade to do the right thing, and they know that it's going to also be the right thing for their bottom dollar down the line. So having these resources, I think, will be supported both by industry sources and foundations.
And we do not have any more questions. So unless somebody else has something to say, we can wrap this up. I do have a hand raised, but I guess there's not an easy way to address that. If you could just put something into the questions if you had one. But thank y'all very much. And
yeah, and thank you, Chuck. I mean, and certainly feel free to send a message to myself or to Nancy if if you have other questions that didn't get answered, or if you want to be involved in this effort as well. Our email addresses are both on the website. Is that correct, Chuck, on the roster?
Yes, they're there.
yeah, I
I
think so.
believe so.
And everybody's got all the emails for this webinar came to me. So if anybody needs the contact information, just respond to the webinar email and I'll get it, and I'll get you in touch with Doug or Nancy.
Excellent. Well, thanks for everyone for participating. I know it's awkward when we're just talking to ourselves, it sounds like, but thanks for all the great questions.
Yes, thank you.